Good morning, I'm Remo, and this is the Daily Signal for August 27th, 2025. Breaking overnight, 5 journalists killed in a devastating Israeli airstrike on a Gaza hospital, including AP and Reuters staff members who were simply doing their jobs. This story has sent shockwaves through the international media community. I'm Remo, and this is the Daily Signal for August 27th, 2025. Stay tuned for the rest of the stories.
Unfiltered. Now,
Here are the other top stories for August 27th, 2025. Australia expels Iranian diplomats after explosive evidence links Tehran to anti-Semitic arson attacks on Sydney and Melbourne synagogues. Gaza City residents flee in panic as overnight Israeli shelling pounds residential outskirts, forcing mass evacuations. Teen terrorist who plotted Taylor Swift Vienna concert massacre walks free without jail time in controversial court decision. French political chaos triggers European stock market plunge, while Wall Street surprisingly edges higher in volatile trading. Massive protests erupt over Gaza hostage negotiations as families demand immediate action from Israeli government. Iran meets European powers in Geneva as devastating new sanctions loom over nuclear program violations. Macron directly confronts Netanyahu, accusing him of weaponizing anti-Semitism for political gain in heated diplomatic exchange. American shoppers scramble for strategies as U.S. prepares to end tariff exemption on goods under $800, threatening price hikes. Ukraine peace deal discussions reach critical juncture as Germany faces pressure to commit troops for potential deployment. Now let's dive into each story. This morning, the journalism world is reeling from a devastating Israeli airstrike that killed 5 journalists at Gaza's Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis. Among the dead are Mariam Daga, who worked freelance for the Associated Press, and Mohammed Salama, an Al Jazeera cameraman who had covered countless stories from this war zone. Here's what happened. Israeli forces conducted 2 separate strikes on the hospital. The first hit the medical facility directly. When rescue workers rushed to help the wounded, a second strike targeted those very rescuers, a tactic that has drawn international condemnation. The attack killed at least 21 people total, but the deaths of these journalists have sparked particular outrage. Ahmad Abu Aziz from Middle East Eye and reporters from Reuters were also among the victims. These weren't combatants. They were professionals documenting one of the world's most important ongoing conflicts. The UN Human Rights Office immediately condemned the killings, demanding accountability and calling the targeting of journalists and health workers unacceptable. This brings the total number of journalists killed in Gaza since October 2023 to over 200, making it one of the deadliest conflicts for media workers in modern history. Why this matters? Press freedom organizations warn that targeting journalists isn't just about silencing individual voices, it's about preventing the world from witnessing what's happening in Gaza. Every journalist killed is a window into this crisis that gets permanently closed. Australia just delivered a diplomatic bombshell, expelling Iranian diplomats and cutting ties with Tehran after explosive evidence proved Iran orchestrated anti-Semitic terror attacks on Australian soil. The evidence is damning. Australia's security agency directly linked Iran to 2 separate arson attacks that shocked the nation. The first targeted Lewis Continental Kitchen, a kosher food company in Sydney. The second hit the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne, terrifying worshippers and the broader Jewish community. Here's the smoking gun. Investigators tracked the attacks to a coordinated Iranian operation. Syed Mohammed Musawi has already been charged with directing the Sydney firebombings. Giovanna Laulu faces charges connected to the Melbourne synagogue attack. These weren't random hate crimes, they were state-sponsored terrorism. Iran predictably denies everything, but Australia isn't buying it. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called the evidence overwhelming and expelled Iranian diplomatic staff immediately. This represents the most serious deterioration in Australia-Iran relations in decades. The broader context is chilling. Anti-Semitic incidents in Australia have skyrocketed since October 7, 2023. Jewish Australians report feeling increasingly unsafe, with synagogues now requiring constant security presence. Community leaders say these attacks represent a dangerous escalation from verbal harassment to actual violence. Why this matters? If Iran is willing to conduct terror operations in Australia, a close U.S. ally thousands of miles from the Middle East, nowhere may be safe from Tehran's reach. This could trigger similar investigations in other Western countries experiencing rising anti-Semitic violence. Panic swept through Gaza City overnight as Israeli forces launched intensive shelling of residential neighborhoods, forcing thousands of Palestinians to flee their homes in darkness. Witnesses described terrifying scenes: families grabbing children and whatever possessions they could carry, running through streets while explosions lit up the night sky. The shelling targeted the outskirts of Gaza City, areas that had been relatively quieter in recent weeks. The timing is significant. This escalation comes just as international pressure was building for a ceasefire. Instead, the violence is intensifying, making any diplomatic solution seem increasingly distant. Palestinian officials report multiple civilian casualties, though exact numbers remain difficult to verify given the ongoing bombardment. What's clear is that this represents another wave of displacement for people who have already been forced to move multiple times since October 2023. Why this matters? Every new wave of displacement makes the humanitarian crisis worse. With limited safe areas remaining in Gaza, civilians are running out of places to go. This cycle of evacuation and re-evacuation is creating a permanent refugee crisis within Gaza itself. A teenager who plotted to carry out a mass casualty attack at Taylor Swift's Vienna concerts has avoided jail time in a decision that's sparking international controversy. The details are disturbing. The 17-year-old had developed detailed plans to attack Swift's scheduled concerts at Ernst Happel Stadium, which would have hosted 65,000 fans per night. Security agencies discovered the plot just days before the shows were set to begin, leading to immediate cancellations. Here's what investigators found: bomb-making materials, detailed venue layouts, and evidence of radicalization through online extremist content. The teen had specifically chosen Swift's concerts because of their massive international profile and young demographic. The court's reasoning for the lenient sentence centers on the defendant's age and cooperation with authorities after arrest. However, victims' rights advocates and security experts are questioning whether this sends the wrong message about terrorism attempts. The broader impact was massive. Swift's 3 Vienna shows were expected to draw 200,000 fans from across Europe. The cancellations cost millions in lost revenue and left thousands of international fans stranded. More importantly, it demonstrated how quickly modern terror threats can emerge and target entertainment events. Why this matters? This case raises fundamental questions about how justice systems handle juvenile terror suspects, especially when their plans could have resulted in mass casualties comparable to major terror attacks. French political turmoil sent European stock markets tumbling this morning, while Wall Street defied expectations with modest gains, creating unusual market dynamics that have traders scrambling. The trigger appears to be escalating instability within President Macron's government, with coalition partners threatening to withdraw support over controversial economic reforms. French government bonds are experiencing their worst sell-off in months as investors flee anything connected to French sovereign debt. Here's the ripple effect. Germany's DAX dropped 1.8%, London's FTSE fell 1.4%, and France's CAC 40 plummeted 2.3% in early trading. Banking stocks are getting hit particularly hard as investors worry about exposure to French government debt. But here's the puzzle. American markets are actually rising. The Dow is up 0.7%, and the S&P 500 gained 0.5% in pre-market trading. Analysts suggest U.S. investors see European instability as potentially delaying European central bank interest rate hikes, which could benefit American companies with European operations. The currency impact is equally dramatic. The euro dropped to its lowest level against the dollar in 3 weeks, while the British pound is also sliding on Brexit-related concerns that French instability could spread. Why this matters? French political stability affects the entire European Union. If Macron's government falls, it could trigger broader European political realignments, just as the continent faces ongoing economic challenges and security concerns related to Ukraine. Massive protests erupted across Israel yesterday as families of Gaza hostages demanded immediate government action, accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of prolonging negotiations for political gain. The demonstrations were the largest since the October 7th attacks, with tens of thousands gathering in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and other major cities. Protesters blocked major highways and surrounded government buildings, bringing parts of the country to a standstill. At the heart of their anger, families believe a hostage deal has been within reach for months, but political considerations keep derailing progress. They point to the Nasser hospital attack, the same one that killed 5 journalists, as evidence that military operations are taking priority over bringing their loved ones home alive. The emotional testimony was heartbreaking. Parents holding photos of children taken captive, spouses demanding to know why their partners remain in Gaza tunnels while diplomatic talks continue. Some families have not heard from their relatives in nearly a year. Netanyahu faces a political dilemma. His coalition partners threaten to leave government if he makes too many concessions to Hamas, but public pressure for a deal is intensifying daily. Recent polls show declining support for continuing military operations without progress on hostages. Why this matters? These protests represent a fundamental shift in Israeli public opinion. The question is no longer whether to negotiate with Hamas, but whether Netanyahu's approach is actually preventing a deal that could save lives. This internal pressure could force major policy changes. High-stakes diplomatic meetings began in Geneva yesterday as European powers delivered an ultimatum to Iran: return to nuclear compliance or face the most severe sanctions in the country's history. The setting is significant. This is the first face-to-face meeting between Iranian officials and European negotiators in 6 months. Both sides describe the talks as potentially the last chance to prevent a complete breakdown of the 2015 nuclear agreement. Here's what's on the table. Europe is offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for Iran rolling back uranium enrichment to levels closer to the original deal limits. Iran, meanwhile, is demanding guarantees that any agreement won't be abandoned if political leadership changes in European capitals. The backdrop makes success unlikely. Iran's uranium stockpile is now 20 times larger than permitted under the original agreement, and enrichment levels have reached 60%, dangerously close to weapons-grade material. European intelligence agencies report Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for multiple bombs within weeks if it chooses. The sanctions threat is real. European officials privately say they're prepared to target Iran's remaining oil exports and completely isolate Iranian banks from international financial systems. This would represent an economic stranglehold potentially more severe than anything Iran has faced. Why this matters? These talks could determine whether the Middle East slides toward a nuclear arms race. If diplomacy fails, Israel has repeatedly threatened military action to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, potentially triggering a regional war. French President Emmanuel Macron directly confronted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in an unprecedented diplomatic clash, accusing him of weaponizing anti-Semitism for political gain. The confrontation occurred during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic call about Middle East tensions. According to sources present, Macron accused Netanyahu of using legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism to deflect criticism of Israeli military operations in Gaza. Here's the specific trigger. Netanyahu had criticized France's position on Gaza operations, suggesting French criticism played into anti-Semitic narratives. Macron's response was swift and sharp. He accused Netanyahu of cynically exploiting the fight against anti-Semitism to shield Israeli policies from scrutiny. The broader context makes this clash particularly significant. France has experienced a genuine surge in anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th, with Jewish schools and synagogues requiring increased security. Macron has taken strong steps to combat this rise, making Netanyahu's criticism particularly stinging. French officials indicate Macron specifically told Netanyahu that fighting anti-Semitism should not be weaponized to suppress legitimate policy debates. This represents unusually direct language between allies who typically maintain diplomatic courtesy despite disagreements. The relationship has been deteriorating for months. France has become increasingly critical of Israeli operations in Gaza, while simultaneously cracking down on anti-Semitic incidents at home. This creates a complex political environment where Macron faces pressure from both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli constituencies. Why this matters. When close allies engage in such public diplomatic confrontations, it signals broader international isolation for Israeli policies. Macron's willingness to directly challenge Netanyahu could encourage other European leaders to take stronger stances. American consumers are rushing to finalize online purchases before the U.S. eliminates a key tariff exemption that has kept millions of small international purchases tax-free for years. The change affects the de minimis rule that currently allows packages valued under $800 to enter the U.S. without tariffs or extensive customs processing. Once this exemption ends, shoppers will face tariffs on virtually all international purchases, regardless of size. Here's the immediate impact. Popular international retailers like Shein, Temu, and AliExpress, which have built business models around this exemption, will become significantly more expensive for American consumers. A $50 purchase could suddenly cost $60 to $70, depending on tariff rates for specific products. Consumer advocates are recommending several strategies. Complete pending international orders immediately, stock up on frequently purchased items from international retailers, and research domestic alternatives for products typically bought overseas. Some retailers are already adjusting by opening U.S. warehouses to avoid the new rules. The timing hits during peak back-to-school and early holiday shopping seasons, when millions of Americans typically purchase electronics, clothing, and gifts from international websites. Industry estimates suggest this could affect over 100 million annual purchases. The policy rationale focuses on protecting American businesses from unfair competition and generating additional customs revenue. However, consumer groups argue this essentially functions as a regressive tax that disproportionately affects lower-income shoppers who rely on inexpensive international goods. Why this matters? This represents one of the most significant changes to U.S. trade policy affecting everyday consumers in decades. The economic ripple effects could reshape online retail and force major changes in how Americans shop. Ukraine peace negotiations have reached a critical juncture as pressure mounts on Germany to commit troops for potential post-conflict peacekeeping, testing Berlin's long-standing reluctance toward military deployments. The discussions center on security guarantees that would be essential for any lasting peace agreement. International mediators are proposing a multinational force to monitor any eventual ceasefire lines and help rebuild Ukraine's security capabilities. Germany faces unprecedented pressure as Europe's largest economy and Ukraine's second-largest military supporter after the United States. German participation would be crucial for any peacekeeping mission's credibility. However, German constitutional constraints and public opinion have historically limited overseas military deployments. The internal German debate is intense. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius supports enhanced military engagement, while Chancellor Olaf Scholz remains cautious about committing German forces to what could become a long-term deployment. Recent polling shows Germans split roughly evenly on the issue. The broader context complicates decisions. Any peace deal would likely require international guarantees to prevent future Russian aggression. Without major power commitment, particularly from Germany, Ukraine might reject any agreement as inadequate for long-term security. Alternative proposals include enhanced training missions, financial support for Ukrainian forces, and intelligence sharing agreements. However, Ukrainian officials have indicated that symbolic support won't be sufficient. They need concrete security commitments that would deter future Russian attacks. Why this matters? German decisions could determine whether any Ukraine peace deal actually holds. Without robust international backing, any agreement might simply provide Russia time to regroup for future aggression. This tests Germany's evolution from post-war pacifism toward active international security responsibility. Three critical themes emerge from today's stories that will shape global politics in the coming months. First, the international order faces unprecedented strain. From Gaza to Ukraine, from Iran's terror operations to France's political instability, traditional diplomatic solutions are failing, while military tensions escalate. The killing of journalists in Gaza and the Iran-Australia connection show conflicts are becoming more global and targeting civilian society directly. Second, economic nationalism is reshaping trade relationships. The U.S. tariff changes and European market reactions to French politics demonstrate how quickly economic policies can ripple globally. Consumers and businesses must adapt to a world where international commerce faces increasing restrictions and political risks. Third, alliance relationships are being tested in real time. Macron's direct confrontation with Netanyahu, Germany's reluctance on Ukraine deployments, and Australia's break with Iran all show traditional diplomatic courtesies breaking down as stakes increase. These aren't temporary disagreements. They represent fundamental shifts in how allied nations interact when facing severe challenges. The common thread: we're witnessing the breakdown of post-Cold War international stability. Thanks for staying informed with the Daily Signal. I'm Remo. We'll see you tomorrow with the latest developments on these evolving stories.
Unfiltered.